I think the Fed absolutely does not get the pain that's involved with a bubble breaking. You can see that in the history of the last 50 years. Greenspan encouraged the tech bubble. He bragged about the productivity gains from the internet that would last forever. Actually, productivity has declined slowly but surely since then. When it broke, it caused a lot of pain. Bernanke learned nothing. He encouraged the housing bubble. He denied its existence, even though it was a 3 sigma, 1 in a 100-year event that had never occurred in American history before. And what have we learned? We just went straight back into the game, overstimulating, pushing the rates down, down and down they have gone for 50 years. So they started at 16% on the long bond, and now the real return you would get is -2. They act as if a low rate is a panacea and comes with no downside. That is clearly nonsense. It's created, I think, the biggest evil in our society, and that is inequality. If you drive up the price of assets systematically, and it's bound to happen if you drive the rates down to negative territory, who do you make money for? You make money for the people with assets. Who owns the assets? The top 1% has 35% of all the assets. The top 10% have practically all the assets. What's the asset ownership of the bottom half? A rounding error, practically none. So you mark up the assets, and that's your contribution to society. What you're doing is pushing down on labor, pushing down on the bottom half, with no offset from increasing their assets, since they have none. And you're making the top 1% ineffably rich. And the data bears that out right down to the last 2 years, when the top 0.1% has doubled its wealth during COVID. And the bottom 50%, I can assure you, has not doubled its wealth. The dominance of a handful of firms has increased steadily in most subsets. And so profit margins have gone up, and the power of corporations has gone up, and they've been able to use more of their power in influencing government. And they have. There is a lot of regulatory capture where people from business tend to run the agencies that regulate the industries. So it's been a wonderful time to make money at the corporate system. And the share of GDP that goes to corporate profits has steadily risen. And the share going to labor has steadily fallen. This makes it a dreadful cousin with the asset class inflation that we've had. They both have two things in common. They make the rich better off, and they make the working class worse off. And that I think is the great poison at the moment in the American system. If we do not address rising inequality, we will be in real trouble. We are the least equal society, measurably, in the developed world. We have the least fluid economic mobility, for heaven's sake. You know, when I arrived in America in the 60s, it was a joke how rigid the UK was. The UK is now less rigid than the US. The number of people moving from the bottom quarter to the top quarter in a lifetime is half of what it is, say, in the Swedens of the world, in the US. We are the least mobile. I mean, this is so un-American. It is so far from what people believe to be the case. But check it. We're the least mobile, we're the least equal society. And it's a poisonous influence. And we have facilitated it. We have moved the taxes on capital gains tax, dividend tax, interest tax. We've moved them down, and by definition, the amount that has to come from income has gone up. I haven't written about inflation for 20 years. When I did quarterly letters, I never featured inflation. I didn't think it was on the radar screen. It is now on the radar screen once again. It's not that inflation will go roaring back to 1972 or 1982. It's that it will always be part of the discussion from now on, in my opinion. Instead of forgetting about it, it will be spiking and irritating and falling back and then spiking again. It will be part of the scenery in the way it used to be in the second half of the 20th century. There's a lot about this economy, I think, that will be dragged back into the late 20th century. We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period for 20 years, which I think is ending. Let me put it this way. We're in the early stages of running out of raw materials. Of course, we live on a finite planet. There's only a certain amount of cheap oil, cheap nickel, cheap copper, and we're beginning to hit some of those boundaries. And we're going to have bottlenecks here, there, and everywhere. The food price index of the UN is about as high as it gets. Growing food is not getting easier. Climate change is coming with heavy floods, serious droughts, and higher temperatures. None of these make farming easier. So we're going to live in a world of bottlenecks and shortages and price spikes, and we have to get used to it and learn to manage our way around it. I have spent a lot of time in the last year on cryptocurrencies. They may not be good for buying groceries. They may not be a store of value. They may be highly correlated with the speculative stocks. They may have come down 40, 50% like the specs, but they do something way over my head to understand. The question is there a technology, blockchain, that will turn out to be very useful, whether done by corporations and governments and everybody else? I am sure the answer is yes. There's a useful technology, etc., etc. Does this justify trillions of dollars of perceived wealth? No, it doesn't. If they can find a usefulness for it when it's integrated into the economy, it will perhaps facilitate productivity like many ideas do. Very few ideas of that kind floated around and were capitalized at trillions of dollars, even though they had an enormous impact on the economy. Blockchain should be like one of those.
So maybe not quite as much of a crypto skeptic.
You could say the internet, by the way. The internet has created enormous value, but it didn't float around internet units, which were capitalized and became worth trillions of dollars. And I admire them for not doing that. They deliberately went out of their way to make the internet a facilitator and not a way of amassing money in itself. I tell you what I think about the future, and that is the green will turn out to be just a subset of a bigger, more comprehensive issue, and that is, loosely speaking, living within our means. We have simply shot way beyond the long-term capacity of the planet to deal with it. And one of the problems is waste. And this is not just climate change and greenhouse gases, but of course, plastics. It's also poisons. We generate so many toxic chemicals that there is strong indication that the planet is really not conducive to life. We are killing off our insect life. We're killing off all manner of animal life. The world can do just fine without Homo sapiens, but it can't deal without insects because of a cascade effect. All the little critters that eat insects, all the birds that eat insects, all the amphibians, etc. And they begin to go out of business. And then the things that need them and the plants that needed them to be fertilized, one thing after another goes out of business. And so nature is beginning to fail. And in the end, if we don't fix that, we begin to fail as well. And we see that in the toxicity numbers. Human fertility is going to hell. We have 1/3 of the sperm count that we had at the end of World War II. This is not impressive. Mostly we were over-engineered, so we get away with that. But in the last 20 years, we've gone from young couples needing help, a rounding error, to maybe 15% of every young couple in the US now needs help. And that's a more or less a global problem.